The cracked wood of the widow's porch creaked beneath her worn boots as she stood frozen, eyes fixed on the figure dragging himself through the thorny brush at the edge of her land. The Apache warrior's chest rose and fell raggedly, crimson streaking through his dusty clothes. The weight of the moment pressed down hard. Helping him meant risking everything she'd fought to protect. Turning away meant condemning a dying man to the merciless desert. The silence between them screamed louder than words. Her ranch lay at the very edge of civilization, where the barren earth stretched endlessly under a searing sun, and the wind whispered old fears through the withered sagebrush. This land was a harsh mistress, unyielding and lonely. The sky above, a pale blue canvas streaked with distant, restless clouds, bore witness to countless stories of hardship, loss, and survival. Every creak, every rustle, carried a weight of isolation that clung to the widow's bones as surely as the dust in the air. She was a woman hardened by grief, her husband long lost to the unforgiving wilds, her days marked by the agonizing stillness that follows loss. The ranch, her only tether to the world, had grown smaller with each passing season, swallowed bit by bit by the relentless desert. When the Apache appeared, wounded and desperate, her breath caught in her throat. He moved with quiet dignity despite his pain, each step a testament to a spirit unbroken by cruelty. Still, the fear in her eyes betrayed the silent war within her, a dawning compassion warring with the harsh judgment stamped by neighbors who whispered about Indian troubles. The choice lay bare before her. To offer sanctuary was to invite danger into her fragile haven. To deny aid was to deny a part of her humanity. Her hands trembled slightly as she cupped water from the worn tin canteen, drying it first on her sleeve before kneeling beside him and pressing it to his cracked lips. The warrior's gaze met hers, steady, wary, yet strangely full of unspoken gratitude. In that moment, a tenuous bond began to weave itself amid the desert dust and looming threats. Beyond the small cabin, the distant murmur of the nearby settlement seeped through the stillness. The faint eyes of watchful neighbors, harboring suspicion and poised to act if the danger they feared, crept closer. Her heart pounded as she dared to lift him into the dim shelter, wrapping him in tattered blankets salvaged from years past. Each movement echoed with risk, yet the widow's resolve shone through the quiet anguish that lined her face. This was a gamble painted with shadows, the hope of mercy against the cold dawn of retribution. Suddenly, carried on the restless wind, came the unmistakable sound of pounding hooves and gruff voices, harbingers of judgment riding fast and unforgiving. The gathered threat approached like a dark cloud swallowing the horizon, their intent as clear as the steel glinting on their belts. The widow's breath caught, her eyes locked on the narrow path where a mounted posse rapidly closed in, suspicion burning in their gaze like wildfire. The fragile sanctuary she had offered was about to be shattered. Many travelers who follow our forgotten legends through these rugged lands tell us the winding trails of fate, or YouTube's treacherous algorithm, sometimes quietly undo their subscriptions without warning. Before the next perilous path unfolds and a new twist arrives, take a quick look down below the video and make sure you're still signed up with our band to not lose the thread of the story. We don't want you missing a single voice echoing through this valley. Check your subscription now and join our saga. The morning sun barely pierced the heavy curtain of dust and whispers that cloaked the widow's land. Inside the cramped cabin, the thin light revealed the faint rise and fall of the Apache warrior's chest beneath ragged cloth. His eyes, dark pools of pain and defiance, flickered open for a moment, tracing the worn lines of the woman sitting nearby. The widow's rough hands, hardened by years of toil and sorrow, moved with surprising gentleness as she offered him water. Their exchanged breaths, shallow, weighted by unspoken fears. Outside, a restless wind carried the distant clatter of voices and the soft murmur of scurrying feet through dry brush. The widow's gaze hardened. The pact between them, fragile as the cracked earth, was no longer a secret. The warrior's body held not only wounds inflicted by bullets and blades, but also scars carved by exile and hostility that stretched far beyond the stark desert. As he whispered words she barely understood, struggling with a tongue. Foreign and sharp, she caught fragments of a story, a pain not unlike her own. Each phrase was a thread weaving them closer, a bridge over chasms built by years of fear and suspicion. Her heart twisted as she realized that in saving this man, she had also unearthed a history of bloodshed and banishment. The relentless push of settlers and soldiers, the erasure of a people from these very lands she called home. Yet in the quiet, the warrior's presence pulsed with a quiet dignity, a reminder of resilience amidst ruin. Beyond the weather-beaten walls, the murmurs grew louder. The once faint whispers from the surrounding community twisted into pointed glances and bitter words susurrating between neighbors. The widow could feel their judgment tightening like a noose. Their world was one, ruled by fear of the unknown, the stubborn adherence to old grudges fueling talk of turning her in, to hand over the wounded Apache and sever the fragile hope she had kindled. Her solitude, once a shield forged from loss, now felt like a prison. Every creak of the porch, every snapping twig outside, echoed with the threat of betrayal. Yet the flicker of compassion in her chest refused to wane. She knew the cost was high. Her property, her reputation, even the fragile peace she had clung to, all stood at risk. But so did the fading breath of the man before her. As the warrior's gaze met hers, she saw the flicker of acknowledgement, a silent pact underscored by shared desperation. He was not merely a stranger in need. He was a symbol of a larger struggle, a living testament to the shadows stalking the land. His silence was heavy with stories he dared not speak aloud. His wounds, proof of battles fought in hidden corners of a world growing narrower and crueler. The shade cast by gathering clouds seemed to close in, swallowing the horizon, where soon the harsh clatter of hooves would break the fragile calm. Hours stretched thin as they shared the cramped space, the widow learning to interpret the subtle signs of the warrior's pain and hope. Each quiet word, a beacon in the encroaching darkness. Meanwhile, the edges of the small settlement darkened with urgency. Groups of colonists, hardened by fear and suspicion, whispered of rounding up the Indian threat. Rumors circled like carrion crows, tales of a wounded Apache hiding under the protection of an isolated widow. Calls for action stirred the anxious townsfolk, a simmering storm of hostility ready to erupt. The widow could feel the cold eyes of the approaching patrol slicing through the brittle silence. Her breath came shallow, each thump of her heart a summons to courage. The land she tended, with quiet resolve, was no longer just her refuge, but the battleground of unseen wars, between mercy and survival, fear and humanity. Outside, the sun dipped low, casting long shadows that danced like specters across the cracked earth. Suddenly, the faint sound of distant hoofbeats shattered the uneasy quiet. Mounted figures appeared on the ridge, a patrol of colonists sweeping the horizon, their weapons glinting harshly, faces set in grim determination. They moved with the relentless certainty of those hunting prey, their intent unmistakable. The widow's gaze snapped to the door as the first horse crested the rise, dust churning beneath heavy hooves. Her hand instinctively moved near the hidden rifle propped unused in the corner, not out of desire for violence, but as a desperate bid for control, in a moment slipping fast from her grasp. Inside, the Apache warrior stirred, pain sharpening his eyes despite weakness. A flicker of understanding passed between them. The time for hiding was waning. The fragile alliance they'd forged now stood on the precipice of destruction. As the patrol drew nearer, whispers grew louder in the widow's mind. Old fears, long-buried doubts, yet also resolve. The wild openness of the land outside held echoes of freedom, whispered in the wind that moved the withered sagebrush, and in the distant, haunting call of Mustangs, drifting like ghosts over the dry hills, returning to a world they had not seen for years. At dawn, when the patrol's shadow loomed largest, the earth itself seemed to pulse with a silent answer. The wild Mustangs galloped over the horizon's edge, a sudden storm of hooves and untamed spirit, their thunderous arrival breaking the hold of fear and forever altering the fate that bound the widow and the Apache warrior. The wind carried the noise of their coming as the patrol stopped at the boundary, watching, caught between suspicion and awe. And in that charged moment, the widow knew that whatever came next would change everything, because the wild had returned to claim its place once more. The days bled into one another on the widow's lonely homestead, the sun carving long, harsh shadows a cracked earth. Inside the modest cabin, the Apache warrior's breath grew steadier, though every movement still caused the flare of pain beneath his ragged skin. The widow watched him with a guarded tenderness. A fragile connection formed between two souls bound by loss and the weight of exile. Outside, the unrelenting wind pulled at the edges of the tattered curtains, carrying the scent of dry sage and the distant murmur of the unsettled land. The isolation that had once been the widow's sanctuary now pressed down like a leaden cloak, thickening with every concerned glance, cast her way from the few neighbors who dared approach her threshold. Whispers followed her like thorny vines, stitching suspicion into the very soil she called home. One morning, as the warrior stirred weakly beneath the thin blanket, a young colonist arrived at the edge of her property. His eyes were sharp, narrowed with a mixture of curiosity and hostility. The widow squinted against the rising sun, sensing the tension radiating from him like heat from dry earth. "Why keep him here?" the young man demanded, voice rough as gravel. "He's trouble. Ain't no place for that kind of dangerous company out here." The widow's gaze hardened. "He's hurt. I'm not about to let him die on my land." His lips curled into a bitter twist. "You sheltering an Apache only paints a target on your back. The others'll come. They won't care for mercy." The unease settled heavier between them than the desert heat. Yet beneath the hostility, a quiet desperation simmered on the widow's face. A steel forged not from ignorance, but from a deep well of grief and stubborn compassion. The warrior shifted, eyes half-lidded in exhaustion, but when he looked at the young colonist, something unspoken passed between them. A wary defiance, born of years spent walking the narrow path between worlds. The widow saw fragments of his story in those eyes, a tale etched by exile, honor, and an ancient pain too vast for words. Days turned into a rhythm of survival shared in silence. The widow learned to read his subtle signals, the tightening of a jaw at a sharp pang, the faltering attempt to speak in a tongue so foreign yet layered with dignity. In return, the warrior glimpsed her resilience, a woman scarred by loss, yet unwilling to surrender to solitude. They sat together by the fading embers each evening, the fire's warmth licking their shadows on the cabin walls. Through broken phrases and patient gestures, he began to reveal glimpses of his past, the sacred land that once teemed with life, the Mustangs that roamed freely, mane and tail like waves of wild flame under the endless sky. The stories were shards of a world slipping away, a connection to the earth, as alive as the beating hearts within it. One twilight, as the horizon swallowed the sun's final blaze, the widow stepped outside and froze. Her breath caught on the dry wind. Fresh hoofprints pocked the dusty ground where no tracks had dared linger for years. Mustangs, wild and untamed. They moved with a ghostly grace, a thunderous harmony to their stride that stirred something ancient deep within her chest. The land itself seemed to breathe anew in their wake, the spirited creatures, a fierce reminder of freedom long suppressed. The widow's eyes followed the cautious line of tracks leading toward the hills. Hope rising like a fragile flame against the darkening sky. Behind her, the faint echo of footsteps drew her gaze back to the young colonist, his expression unreadable. For a fleeting moment, the harshness softened, a grudging respect, born not of trust, but of acknowledgement. The Mustangs had returned, unwelcome heralds of change, upon a fractured land. Yet, beneath the fragile peace, the weight of isolation pressed down harder. The widow felt the cold sting of rejection from those who once exchanged nods of neighborly civility. The alliance she'd forged with the Apache warrior deepened, but it placed her squarely against the currents of suspicion swelling in the borderlands. In the quiet moments before dawn, the warrior's hand found hers, a silent vow to endure whatever storms would come. His eyes shimmered with a mixture of pain and hope, reflecting the wild horse's untamed spirit. Together, they shared a fleeting breath of connection, bridging the abyss between two worlds. As the pale light spilled over the horizon, the widow stepped from the porch to witness the Mustangs stirring anew. Their powerful silhouettes emerged from the shadows, muscles rippling beneath sun-bleached coats, eyes alight with fierce independence. The wind carried their restless energy, the earth trembling beneath their pounding hooves, a soundtrack of wild resilience reclaiming its place. She knew then that their fates were entwined. The man she sheltered, the horses that returned, and the unforgiving land that tested all who dared to claim it. The Mustangs' sudden appearance was a sign, a message whispered on the breeze that the desert was waking, the past stirring, and a reckoning near. The young colonists' wary stare fixed on the horizon where the wild horses galloped free. Yet he spoke no word. The unspoken truth hung heavy. This land could no longer be tamed by fear alone. The dawn broke fully as the Mustangs crossed the peaks, wild souls untethered, racing against time and change. The widow felt the stirrings of something fierce within her, a choice no longer just about survival, but about standing tall beside the man who was more than a stranger, and the wild spirits bearing down the wind. Their fragile pact, forged in pain and desperation, now carried the weight of a land awakening once more. And as the wild hooves thundered closer, the widow whispered into the rising light, knowing beyond doubt that the shape of tomorrow would never be the same. The afternoon sun bore down mercilessly on the dusty settlement, as murmurs spread like wildfire through the gathered colonists. Around a flickering campfire on the edge of the clearing, men in worn, dust-caked hats leaned in close, voices low but charged with growing conviction. "That stray Apache's a threat to us all," one growled, eyes glinting with suspicion. "Sheltering him only brings more trouble. Fire, bloodshed. We can't let that stand." Another spat into the dirt. "She's gone soft, that widow. Thinks mercy'll save her. But the land's no place for fools. If she won't hand him over, then she's as much the enemy as he is." Their faces were drawn tight with fear and anger, emotions forged by years of hardship and loss. Old wounds throbbed beneath thin skin, and their words spilled out as a desperate call to arms. A council swiftly convened, voices raised in heated debate about defending the homestead and ridding their borders of perceived danger. The collective fear of the unknown tangled with deep-seated grudges, igniting a firestorm of resentment aimed at the lone woman who dared defy them. Back at the widow's cabin, shadows stretched long across the cracked earth. She stood just outside the door, her frame rigid against the encroaching darkness. Inside, the Apache warrior lay on a cot, his breathing shallow but steady. Dust motes danced in the slanting sunlight as the air trembled with tension, between the two worlds wavering on the edge of collision. Suddenly, the soft crunch of boots on gravel announced the arrival of a silhouette against the fading light. Strong, confident, and cloaked in the earth-toned leathers of his people, Murata Aserada stepped into the widow's clearing with an air of quiet authority. Her eyes, sharp and unyielding as flint, scanned the horizon before settling on the frail figure on the cot. "I heard your call," she said, voice low but resolute. "He is under my protection now." The widow's gaze lifted, measuring this unexpected arrival. Relief mingled uneasily with the rising storm outside. Murata's presence was a pillar of strength, a bridge between harsh traditions and the fragile hope the woman had nursed. She moved with a grace born of hardship, steely hands that had learned to heal as well as to fight. Together, they prepared the cabin with swift efficiency, herbal poultices for the warrior's wounds, whispers of ancient prayers woven into soothing chants. The inside of the small home seemed to pulse with a new energy, drawn from the fierce connection between protector and protected. Outside, the murmurs of the colonists swelled too. A frenzy, plans forged in fear threatened to tear the silence of the open land, their restless gathering like a coming storm, pressing hard against the fragile sanctuary. As the last light faded, a distant rumble pulsed through the valley, a deep, sonorous echo that hummed beneath the breath of the wind. The widow's eyes lifted to the horizon. There, silhouetted against the faint bleed of dawn, shapes moved, fluid and wild, manes catching the pale light as hooves thundered with the power of freedom itself. The wild Mustangs had returned. Their pounding feet shook the dry earth, stirring clouds of dust and memories long buried beneath years of silence. The colonists paused in their council, casting uneasy glances toward the spectral herd racing across the open plains. No one spoke, but the air thickened with an unspoken reverence and a tremor of unease. What ancient force did these untamed spirits carry? What warning did they bring riding the wind at dawn's first blush? The cabin door creaked softly as Murata stood beside the widow, eyes fixed on the horizon, where the Mustangs ran free, a fierce, untethered pulse beating against the tides of fear. In that quiet moment of shared wonder and trepidation, the promise of change hung heavy. The return of the wild horses was a sign, one the land itself whispered through hooves and whispers, a message too profound to ignore. Beyond words, beyond fear, beneath the endless sky, fate was galloping toward a new dawn. The firelight flickered softly against the rough-hewn walls as Murata Aserada moved with steady purpose. Through the widow's cabin, her presence was a quiet storm of strength and conviction, a lifeline woven from the threads of an ancient heritage. The warrior lay resting on the cot, his chest rising and falling with more steadiness than the day before, though pain lingered like a shadow beneath his skin. His eyes, dark and deep, watched Murata with something between gratitude and weary relief. "We must hold fast," Murata whispered, her voice a low chant, threading into the stillness. "These Mustangs, they are not just horses. They carry the old spirits, guardians of the land and those who walk it with respect. We protect them, we honor their pact." The widow, standing nearby, with hands calloused by years of toil, listened intently. She drew in the scent of dry herbs Murata crushed expertly in her palms, sage, cedar, and sweetgrass, filling the room with an earthiness that seemed to steady the very air. Here, amid whispered prayers to forgotten gods, the old wounds of exile and loss felt less heavy. The Apache warriors stirred on the cot, voice hoarse but resolute. They must live. Freedom in their hooves, like wind on my people's land. Murata's eyes met his with understanding. Your mission has become ours as well. The colonists do not see these creatures as sacred, only obstacles. We face more than just fear. We face those who would destroy freedom's last breath. Outside, the widow's property seemed to hold its breath. The returning Mustangs were no longer distant phantoms across the horizon. Their thunderous presence stirred the loose earth and rattled the brittle branches of the scrubland. Each powerful stride echoed the rhythm of the past, a wild heartbeat challenging the creeping tide of order and boundaries. But danger was tightening its grasp. Murata's sharp gaze caught movement beyond the dim flicker of the cabin's lone lantern. Figures, shadowed by the twilight, paced beyond view, armed colonists preparing for a reckoning. The smell of gunpowder hung faintly on the dry breeze, mingling uneasily with the scent of sage and sweat. The widow's jaw clenched, eyes burning with quiet fire. They come with hatred, ready to tear apart everything we've tried to protect, she said, voice hard. But beneath the steel was a trembling hope, fragile and precious, held tight like a whispered prayer before dawn. The Apache warrior lifted a shaky hand, reaching out to clasp the widow's. Despite the pain etched into his every movement, his grip was firm, a pact sealed not just by survival, but by a shared purpose. Murata stepped to the door, the wind catching the edges of her worn cloak. Our strength lies not just in weapons, but in what we protect. The Mustangs, the land, the stories bound to this earth. They will stand with us if we stand for them. Night deepened and the air grew heavy with anticipation, the silence thick with unspoken fears. Then, under the shadow of a sky, star-pierced and vast, the Apache warrior quietly spoke of betrayal, a taint within their fragile sanctuary. I feel a snake among the shadows, he muttered, eyes narrowed with suspicion. A watcher, hidden in friendly faces. The widow's breath caught, cold and sharp as desert night. Betrayal from within. This threat was more dangerous than any armed posse beyond the ridge. The unseen knife strikes deeper, unravels trust like dry grass caught in flame. Murata's eyes darkened. Then we must root it out before it poisons all. The spies among us will sell blood for coin or fear. They will burn the fragile threads we've woven here. Together they stood, three figures bound by fate, a woman hardened by loss, a warrior fueled by survival, and a protector carrying the weight of an ancient people. Their alliance was fragile but fierce, like the wild horses that ran free beyond their sight. With every whispered word, with every breath drawn heavy with uncertainty, a new resolve took shape amongst them. They would defend this land, these creatures, and each other against shadow and steel alike. Then, just as the winds shifted and night folded into the first hues of dawn. The panic came in the form of discovery. Fresh tracks, a secret revealed, etched into the dust nearby. The Apache warrior stiffened, his gaze burning into the growing light. There, now, the marks of a betrayer. The widow's eyes scanned the horizon, heart pounding a relentless rhythm. Somewhere among the neighboring homesteads, closer than they knew, a spy watched and waited. And beneath the awakening sky, the returning wild Mustangs moved like whispered thunder, not just beasts, but the very soul of defiance, racing against the coming storm. The betrayal had shattered the fragile calm that once lingered in the widow's cabin. Shadows danced ominously beneath the flickering candlelight as the Apache warrior lay tense on his cot, the sharp ache in his shoulder reminding him of wounds both fresh and old. His dark eyes narrowed with suspicion, scanning the dim corners of the room as if the very walls whispered secrets. Outside, the land breathed a restless warning. The massed wild Mustangs, stirred by the growing tension, paced along the ridge under the pale light of dawn. Their hooves struck the earth with measured thunder, an ancient drumbeat that echoed the urgency in the widow's chest. The widow stood by the doorway, her silhouette framed by the first gray light, face grave. "We can't hide anymore," she murmured, voice steady despite the storm within. "The stalker is closer than we thought. Someone among the neighbors watches us, waiting for the right moment to strike." Murata Asarata's sharp gaze met hers, a flicker of fury kindling behind her calm exterior. "A snake in the grass is a threat more dangerous than arrows or guns. If we don't root it out, all we've built here will unravel." The warrior's hand, feeble but resolute, reached for the widow's. Trust, broken like dry wood. We must stand stronger. Their alliance, fragile as a thin branch against a howling gale, forged itself anew in the face of this betrayal. They moved with purpose, voices hushed, to prepare a defense as the low murmurs of an approaching conflict grew louder beyond the boundary of the homestead. The wild Mustangs, the spirit of the land and freedom incarnate, gathered in increasing numbers, their manes rising like flames against the dawn sky. They formed an unspoken barrier, a living shield between the two worlds, the indomitable wild against human threat. The widow's gaze followed the creature's graceful yet powerful strides, finding in their untamed presence a fierce hope that mirrored her own stubborn will to protect. Hours before the sun could climb fully, the distant murmur of agitated voices and restless movement reached the cabin. The colonists were readying for what seemed an inevitable confrontation. Gunpowder scent mingled with dry sage and dust, hanging thick in the cool air. Inside, the warrior's voice cut through the tension, hoarse yet commanding. They come, hungry for war. But they forget, these Mustangs, not just animals, spirit walkers, free like wind on the plains, can't be caged. Murata's jaw set hard. They don't understand. Their fear is a fire, and fire destroys everything in its path. We must be the barrier against that blaze. The widow paced the small room, heart hammering yet resolute. Every step measured, every breath a promise. her thoughts churned, a sacrifice already made. Countless more looming on the horizon. For this land, for the life that pulsed in these wild horses, for the man who had become both a stranger and kin. Yet the wounds inflicted by betrayal gnawed deep. Whispers of distrust seeped faster than any bullet. Who among their neighbors could have betrayed their fragile sanctuary? The answer eluded them, but the poison spread. A sudden gust rattled the weather-worn doorframe. Murata moved to steady it, her eyes narrowing toward the small window, half expecting eyes to peer back in the darkness. The certainty of unseen watchers tightened the knot of tension. Outside, the herd of Mustangs shifted, muscles rippling beneath coats mottled by the dust of many seasons. Their eyes glinted, alert as if sensing the looming storm themselves. The land responded. The earth hummed beneath the pounding hooves, a pulse beating in time with the rising dread within the cabin walls. The widow inhaled sharply, steeling herself. If they come for us, it won't be just bullets and anger we'll face. It will be the breaking of everything we hold dear. The Apache warrior, strained but unwavering, added, "Then we fight, with heart and with spirit, for the land that remembers us." Murata stepped to the door, cloak billowing like a banner in the stirring wind. Her gaze swept the horizon, where the wild Mustangs danced a fierce ballet of freedom and defiance. Our strength lies not only in arms, but in this land, these horses, and the bonds we forge. The Mustangs choose us as their protectors. They run with us and through us. Night melted into tentative dawn, the horizon bleeding light that fused with the wild thunder of hooves. The promise of war hung thick and electric, but so too did a stubborn hope. Suddenly from the east, a fresh sound shattered the tense stillness. Hoofbeats, but fewer, and at a cautious pace. The warrior's eyes flickered with recognition and alarm. Another rider, not friend, a trespasser, closer than moths to flame. The widow moved beside the warrior, heart pounding against her ribcage. The cold blade of fear sliced through her resolve. Spies bred destruction from silence. Her voice a whisper, yet fierce with determination. The danger is no longer just beyond the ridge. It is inside our circle. We must ready ourselves for what comes next. Outside, the wild Mustangs surged forward, their bodies a blur against the awakening sky. A thunderous tide that stirred the broken earth, a living force weaving between the living and the dead, between war and hope. And in the rising light, the Apache warrior's breath hitched, eyes flickering with pain and fierce clarity, as he found himself once again pushed to the brink, his life hanging fragile and fragile as the dawn. The attack came unseen, swift and merciless. Another wound, deeper this time, threatening to steal from him the fragile thread of life they had so carefully preserved. The afternoon light dimmed beneath heavy clouds that seemed to press down on the widow's land, cloaking the homestead in an uneasy twilight. The Apache warrior lay weakened on his cot, breaths coming slow and shallow, a fragile rhythm tethered to the fierce will that still burned behind his dark eyes. Around him, the cabin's sparse warmth hummed with a mix of hope and shadow, as if the space itself braced for the storms gathering beyond its thin walls. Outside, the fading sun cast long fingers over the cracked earth, reaching toward the horizon where wild Mustangs stirred like restless spirits. Their silhouettes moved with a regal grace across the dusty plains, a living pulse of freedom and defiance against the creeping tide of confinement. The widow watched from the porch, her gaze heavy with resolve. The thunder of pounding hooves had long ceased to be a simple sound. It had become a call that stirred the ancient heartbeat of the land and those who dared protect it. Mirada Asarada's figure emerged from the swirling dust, steady and unyielding as stone carved by centuries. Her eyes, sharp and unblinking, scanned the darkening horizon before settling over the fragile form inside the cabin. Her presence was a quiet fortress, a tether to an enduring past in the face of encroaching peril. Without a word wasted, she moved toward the cabin's door, hands steady as she lifted the latch and stepped inside with the surety of the protector she was. "We must hold fast," Mirada murmured, her voice a low chant threading into the tense air. She knelt beside the warrior, pulling from her satchel bundles of herbs and roots exuding dry, pungent scents: sage, sweetgrass, with hints of cedar. Her hands moved deftly, crushing and weaving poultices guided by ancient memory. The widow drew closer, inhaling the earthy aroma, feeling grounded as if the very breath of the land seeped into her lungs. The warrior's eyes flickered with faint gratitude, meeting Mirada's unwavering gaze. "They must live," he whispered, voice hoarse yet resolute. "Freedom like wind, my people's land." Mirada's sharp gaze softened just a fraction. "We bear more than their lives now. The Mustangs belong to the land's spirit, guardians of the old ways. The colonists see only obstacles, not sacred breath." Beyond the cabin's fragile walls, the land seemed to thrum with restless energy. The Mustangs, tens of them now, moved in fluid harmony across the ridges and valleys. Their pounding hooves rocked the brittle ground, sending flurries of dust curling into the dusky air. Their wild neighs tore through the silence like ancestral songs, stirring echoes of forgotten pacts and promises made between people and earth. But darker tides crept close. Mirada's gaze snapped toward the edge of the clearing, where shadows gathered and figures paced like predators circling prey. A faint, acrid scent of gunpowder whispered between dry leaves. The colonists, fueled by fear and fury, were sharpening their will to strike. The widow's eyes narrowed, jaw clenched against the rising storm. "They come with hatred and greed, to tear down what we protect." Her voice was a low fire, steady, fierce, yet laced with the fragile tremor of a heart burdened by sacrifice. The warrior's weakened hand found the widow's. Despite pain racking his frame, his grip was firm, an unspoken vow forged in survival and shared purpose. Mirada rose, stepping toward the cabin's entrance, cloak billowing faintly like a banner in the wind. "Our strength lies beyond the weapons they wield," she said. "It rests in the land, in these horses, and in the bonds we have built. the Mustangs will run with us and through us. Night folded its velvet shroud over the homestead, thick with tension and unvoiced fears. Yet beneath the silence was a simmering resolve. Together, the three stood, woman, warrior, protector, an unlikely trinity bound by loss and hope. But still, a darker shadow crept unseen. The warrior's eyes narrowed sharply. "I feel a serpent in our midst," he whispered, voice tight as bone. "A watcher hidden in friendly faces." The widow's breath hitched, cold and sudden, like a desert breeze slicing through sweltering heat. The threat within, trust, fractured like sun-baked earth, cracking open. Betrayal was a poison, more lethal than any bullet. Mirada's eyes hardened, gaze cutting through the dim shadows. "We must find it before the venom spreads. The traitor will trade blood for fear or coin and burn all to ash." As their whispered planning wove a fragile shield, a sudden sound cut through the quiet. A scrambling scrape in the dust, just beyond the cabin's rough-hewn walls. The warrior stiffened, dark eyes flickering to the doorway. "Here, the mark of the betrayer," he said, voice low yet sharp. The widow stepped forward, scanning the horizon with pounding heart. Nearby, the land held watchful silence. Somewhere among the neighboring homesteads, closer than they dared imagine, a spy waited, eyes sharp, waiting for the moment to strike. Yet defiance thrummed in the air. The wild Mustangs charged beyond view, their manes flying like flames ignited by the wind. Their thunder shook the earth, weaving a fierce chorus of untamed spirit that raised the veil between hope and despair. As the rising dawn cast pale light over the rugged hills, the Apache warrior's breath hitched again, his body pushed to the edge, fighting against shadows that threatened to snuff out his life once more. The fragile sanctuary held, but the storm approaching was no longer just outside the door. The camp was a flurry of tense preparation as the sun struggled to break free from the heavy clouds hanging low over the widow's land. Inside the cramped cabin, the Apache warrior lay resting, his body weakened but still alive, a fragile ember against the encroaching darkness. The widow moved silently through the room, her hands steady as she arranged the sparse weapons and checked the makeshift defenses around the door. Her eyes bore the weight of unspoken fears. Every shadow seemed a threat, every distant sound a harbinger. Outside, the air was thick with anticipation. The dry earth beneath the homestead quivered faintly as the wild Mustangs, long vanished and now returned in force, thundered across the ridge. Their powerful silhouettes charged like living spirits, manes raised, muscles rippling beneath sun-bleached coats. Their hooves pounded with the relentless pulse of freedom, a fierce rhythm that stirred something deep in the widow's chest. It was as if the land itself was rallying with her, these untamed creatures returning to reclaim what was theirs before the settlers had forced them away. Mirada Asarada stood at the edge of the clearing, her eyes sharp and unswerving, watching the horizon where the Mustangs ran wild and free. Her presence was a rock against the swelling tide of danger, a stoic guardian from a lineage that had known these lands far longer than the colonists' footsteps. She had not come to negotiate peace this time, but to stand and fight alongside those bound by blood and conviction. The widow stepped beside her, the hard lines on her face softened by the flicker of fiery determination. "They've come back, just like the old stories said," she whispered, voice barely more than the wind. "The earth won't let go of its secrets. The Mustangs, they're alive again, because we are." Murata's gaze never left the horizon. "The colony's fear has brought them too close," she said. "They see only threat in what they do not understand. But these horses carry the spirit of the land, the spirit we protect. If we fall, so do they." Inside the cabin, the warrior stirred, pain flickering across his features, but eyes burning with fierce clarity. He reached out, grasping the widow's hand with surprising strength. "Must protect all life," he murmured hoarsely. "Mustangs and people, tied." The widow squeezed his hand, the bond between them a silent vow forged in fire and blood. "We will," she said resolutely, "no matter what comes." A sudden shuffling noise outside snapped their attention toward the door. The wind shifted, and with it came the faint, acrid scent of gunpowder. Voices, low but urgent, stirred on the perimeter. Colonists armed and rallying against the encroaching wildness, threatening their fragile dominion. Murata moved to the door, drawing her shawl tighter around her shoulders, readying herself for what was coming. "They come with hatred, with rifles and rage, but their anger cannot break what the land itself fights to protect." The widow's eyes scanned the horizon, watching the Mustangs carve wild, untamed patterns across the hills, an unbroken thunder that hammered against the cruelty of confinement. "We are the last line," the Apache warrior added, voice growing stronger despite his weakness. "The horses bring courage, remind us of the wind's freedom." Outside, the distant rumble of hooves grew louder as more Mustangs poured into the valley, their numbers swelling until the earth seemed alive with pounding hearts and fierce independence. Their presence was a rallying cry as much as a warning, wild, unstoppable, and pure. The widow took a deep breath, feeling the tension coil and release within her, like the curling smoke of a lantern flame. This was no longer just a stand for survival. It was a stand for everything that made the land sacred. The animals, the stories, the hope that still burned beneath years of dust and sorrow. As the colonists drew closer, tightening their encirclement under the ready gleam of rifles and hard-set jaws, a figure approached on horseback, less hurried, more deliberate. The warrior's eyes narrowed at the sight. "Not friend," he whispered. "Spy comes closer." The widow's heart clenched at the revelation, the hidden danger piercing deeper than any bullet. The threat was no longer just outside the walls. It crept amid their own neighbors, eyes watching, waiting to unravel their fragile sanctuary from within. Murata's voice hardened, sharp as the knife sheathed at her side. "We must find the traitor before the poison spreads. The snake strikes where it is least seen, and we cannot afford to bleed from inside and out." The wild Mustangs, sensing the mounting storm, surged forward like a living wave, manes ablaze with the dawn's pale light. hooves drumming a fierce anthem upon the cracked earth. Their breath steamed in the cool morning air, muscles coiled and ready, embodying an unyielding spirit that no man could tame. The cabin's fragile walls trembled with the weight of what was to come, and the widow whispered beneath her breath, a prayer woven from pain and hope alike. Whatever happens now, we stand together. For the land, for the freedom, for the Mustangs. And for each other. The Apache warrior's breath hitched, pain sharpening his gaze, but his spirit blazed strong. With the wild horses charging behind them, and the enemy drawing near, the final fight was about to begin. Outside, at the edge of the gathering light, the leader of the colonists appeared, face set in grim determination, hand resting near his pistol. The air snapped tight with silent challenge. Under the watchful eyes of the wild Mustangs at dawn's first light, the long-awaited confrontation between the Apache warrior and the colonist leader was about to unfold. The first light of dawn painted the horizon with gentle hues of rose and gold, casting long shadows across the cracked earth of the widow's land. The air hung thick with anticipation, heavy as the breath of the earth before a storm. The wild Mustangs thundered closer, their manes catching the awakening sun, each powerful stride echoing centuries of untamed spirit. Inside the cabin, the Apache warrior lay weakened, his breath shallow, but eyes sharp with fierce clarity. His hand grasped the widow's, trembling yet unyielding. Must protect Mustangs and land. Life tide, he whispered, the weight of his mission pressing even in his frailty. Mirada acerada stood watch by the door, her cloak billowing faintly in the early breeze, a silent sentinel against the creeping peril. Her eyes flicked toward the ridge where armed colonists gathered, faces tight with fear and determination. Their rifles glinted harshly, symbols of a world eager to cage the wild, but unready to confront the power it carries. "We stand on the edge of destruction," the widow said quietly, her voice steady but thick with the ache of hard choices. "Their hatred will scorch this land if we don't hold." Murata nodded, voice taut with solemn strength. "They see only enemies where there are souls. But the Mustangs carry more than hooves. They carry the ancient breath of freedom. If we falter, all is lost." Outside, the thunder of the Mustangs swelled, a wild chorus, rising against the rising sun. The ground trembled beneath a stampede, racing not just for survival, but for a promise older than any man-made claim. The herd formed an unyielding barrier, flesh and spirit intertwined between the widow's sanctuary and the encroaching wrath. The colonists halted at the boundary, their eyes wide with awe and fear. The leader, grim and stiff, tightened his grip on his pistol, muscles coiled for confrontation. From the cabin, the weary warrior drew strength from the moment, voice rough but defiant. "We fight with heart and spirit for our land, for the Mustangs." The widow took a breath, steeling herself, a storm inside calmed by resolve. "There's another threat, a snake among us." Her eyes locked with Mirada's. "A spy from their ranks. They would sell us for coin or cowardice." Mirada's gaze darkened, fierce. "Then we must root the treachery out, or it will poison us all. Trust once broken can't stand in a fight like this." Suddenly, A rustle came from the edge of the clearing. The warrior's sharp eyes narrowed. The betrayer moves close, closer than firelight's reach. His hand tightened on the widow's. Their fragile alliance now faced enemies, seen and unseen, dangers within their midst accentuating the peril beyond. Without hesitation, the widow rose, the weight of sacrifice settling deep in her bones. She stepped onto the porch. Gaze swept across the wild herd, their shadows stretching like a living shield across the land. The Mustangs' wild neighs pierced the morning air, a raw anthem of freedom and defiance. Behind her, Murata gathered herbs, murmuring prayers, grounding them both in ancient strength. The land calls us to stand, to protect. The colonists advanced, the first rifle shots cracking through the awakening valley. Chaos exploded. Gunfire and the dust rose like a curtain, hiding the clash of wills. In the fray, the widow moved with fierce determination, firing where needed, her heart beating in time with the wild horses. Murata and the warrior fought close, their movements a blend of desperate survival and sacred duty. Suddenly, the warrior faltered, a fresh wound blooming red across his side. His breath hitched, pain stealing strength. The widow caught him, steadying his falling frame. "No," she whispered fiercely. "You must live. For them, for all of us." He shook his head weakly, eyes burning. "For freedom we endure." As the battle reached its crescendo, the leader of the colonists confronted the warrior directly. Words sharper than bullets were exchanged. Old fears, bitter grudges, and the fragile hope of coexistence clashing in the dusty air. Then, against all odds, the Mustangs surged forward, sweeping between combatants, their untamed presence breaking the violence like an ancient decree. Their wild power silenced rifles and hardened eyes alike. The leader lowered his pistol, the hardness in his gaze giving way to reluctant respect. The fire of war flickered out as understanding dawned. A truce formed in the shadow of wild thunder. The warrior, bloodied but standing, locked eyes with the colonist and nodded, a pact sealed by courage and the land's enduring spirit. Silence fell over the valley. The wild herd galloped free again, their hooves drumming a future unbound. The widow exhaled, worn but unbroken. Murata stepped beside her, voice soft as the rising sun. "This land remembers those who fight with honor. The Mustangs are our legacy, and so are you." The warrior, hand in hers, murmured with a tired smile, "Peace, born of sacrifice." Together, beneath the awakening sky, they witnessed the wild horses fade into the horizon, a living promise of freedom, endurance, and respect. The long night of fear and bloodshed gave way to this new dawn, where hope rode fierce and untethered, and the land breathed alive once more. At last, the widow found a fragile peace nestled in the union of man, spirit, and wild earth. The legacy of their sacrifice, etched deep into the soil, the wild Mustangs had returned, heralds of a tomorrow where coexistence was not just a dream, but a truth galloping free beneath the endless sky.